I just take the mic with me to my seat?
Bring up the rear.
Good evening. We'd like to thank everyone for coming out this evening to the Face of America's panel discussion on education, incarceration, and the war on drugs. Just to give you a little history about the Face of America conference, this is a collaborative effort between Harvard and Stanford universities. We began in last February. We had our first event, which was a satellite discussion on the aims of political correctness, featuring the former chairman of the FCC last May. And then in June, we had Stanford's part of the conference at Stanford in Palo Alto. And tonight, we look forward to this discussion about education, incarceration, and the war on drugs. The purpose of this conference is to enable you to engage in an honest and productive dialogue about an issue that you may have considered very well on a superficial level, but may not have considered in depth. Right now, we have Allende Jean-Baptiste to moderate this discussion. Thank you for coming out.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start out by introducing our distinguished panel of experts and guests. I'd like to start with United States District Judge for the District of Massachusetts, Judge A. David Mazzone, who is incidentally Harvard class of 1950. 5-0. Can I get a 5-0? Judge Mazzone has served on many distinguished commissions and has been a part of many important organizations in shaping legislation, shaping the way that we practice law in Massachusetts and throughout the country. Two of the very important and relevant ones. He was the chairman of the Federal Judicial Center Committee on Sentencing, Probation, and Pretrial Services from 1987 to 1989, and he was the vice chair of the United States Sentencing Commission and a member between 1990 and 1997. And in these capacities, he was instrumental in rewriting and changing the way that sentencing works specifically, for example, crack versus powder cocaine. And so we wanted to bring him here to share his knowledge with us, his expertise. Judge Mazzone, I wanted to ask you to start off to tell us a little bit about the social, the political effects, the economic effects of mandatory sentencing, and tell us a little bit about what was going on, what went into the work that you did in terms of sentencing versus with crack versus powder cocaine.
Is this my introductory? Is this,
yes,
this
yes,
room?
it is.
Okay. Well, those are very specific questions, and I think in order for me to answer them, in order to inform you as much as I can, I think you should know that there was a pre-guideline sentence stage in our criminal justice system on the federal level. I've been a state court judge, and I've been a federal judge for 26 years. When I started out, I had virtually no control over the discretion I used in order to impose a sentence. I could impose a sentence that I felt was appropriate as long as it did not exceed the statutory limit. I could impose a sentence from probation to 10 years. And I might do that in my courtroom while down the hall, a defendant who may have been similarly situated, may have committed a similar robbery or some other crime, would be before another judge and might receive a sentence much, much different. So it was a very disparate sentencing system. And there was a parole commission then that stepped in after the sentence was over, as far as I was concerned, whatever it was, and sentenced a person to imprisonment. Then the parole commission stepped in, and the parole commission said, well, we want to take a look at the same defendant to tell you when this defendant is eligible for release to the community. In 1984, right in the middle, I'd already been in the court then for almost 9 years, 8 years. At that point, Congress stepped in with the Criminal Justice Reform Act, part of which was the Sentencing Commission. And they tried to cure what they perceived as disparate sentences by creating a system of guidelines, and that presented the sentencing judge now with a range of sentence, not to go below a certain level and not to go above a certain level, so that the defendant who received a sentence in courtroom A for the same crime committed under roughly the same circumstances with the same criminal prediction, which was always a criminal history score, how many times have you done this before, would receive roughly the same sentence as the defendant in 2. That was the effort that was made. And I've been working under that sentence since, as I say, 1987, when it really effectively, when the Supreme Court affirmed the cases that said we should do that. And in the course of this, in 1990, I was appointed to the United States Sentencing Commission. And in that time, I had worked. I'm not sure I've been effective. I regard the 7 years I spent down there as probably the most frustrating time of my judicial career, because I still had cases here in Boston that I had to manage, and that was a full-time job in Washington, so I ran back and forth. But it was frustrating because no matter what you say and what we say here today and how the judges feel about the unfairness of the sentences and the draconian nature of the guidelines and the excessive harsh sentences and the fallout on those people in the system who haven't had the opportunity, the race-based, the inner city kids and those people, that's where the sentences were aimed. At least that's where they fell, even if they weren't aimed there. We were not able to change it because above us was Congress. And it's very easy to post yourself very early on the I'm tough on crime. And my opponent is soft on crime. My opponent opposes mandatory minimum sentences. That person is soft on crime. And I'll give you one example, then I'll have used up my time. Senator D'Amato from New York, in the middle of all this discussion about what we're going to do about sentences, how we're going to fix the crack cocaine, powder cocaine differential, we're trying to fix it. Senator D'Amato files a new bill, and he wants 52 new minimum mandatory sentences. At the same time that we're trying to work it out, we're trying to make it all fit together and not make it so unfair, he files one with 52, a bill. And you know how many votes he got? There's 52. And you know, there were only 5 Democrats who voted against him, one of which was my sponsor, would not vote against him, Senator Kennedy. That shows you how this works, you see, politically. The idea of being labeled soft on crime was too great a burden. So I hope I'll be able to give you a little bit more on the crack cocaine differential, because we didn't do it. You see, we didn't do it. We tried it. We tried to do it, and we sent it to Congress, and they deep-sixed it.
Well, I'm sure that
We tried to
some
fix the
members of
100 to 1 differential,
our audience will have some questions
and they deep sixed it.
that deal with that issue very shortly, as soon as we talk to the other panelists and ask them to fill us in on their level of expertise and where they come from. Now, our next very distinguished guest is Natasha H Williams. She's currently an A. Leon Higginbotham Jr. Research Fellow in Social Justice at the law school, as well as a PhD candidate at the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. She's a trainee at the Heller Graduate School for Social Policy and Management in Brandeis University. She wrote a dissertation on the drug court model, the structural differences among adult drug courts and the effect of program completion rates. And she studies the efficacy of drug courts. And so, Natasha, as she said she would like to be called, could you fill us in on, could you give us just a little bit of information on the drug courts, on drug treatment programs within that model and drug treatment in jails?
Yes, I can, and thank you so much for this opportunity to speak about my research. Research indicates that only 15% of prisoners get drug treatment. However, in the state, in the state prisons, about 70% need treatment, and in the federal prisons, about 30%. I became very interested in drug courts because early on in my career, I worked in criminal homicide narcotics division, and I kept seeing people cycle through the system, really with no solutions, no answers, the same offenders coming in with the same type of offenses. So when I went to Brandeis, I became very interested in the study of drug courts, and I prepared a few remarks that I would like to share with you on this subject. Since the declaration of the war on drugs, the number of drug-abusing offenders has overwhelmed both the criminal justice and law enforcement systems. The ineffectiveness of traditional methods of punishment, such as sentencing, probation, and parole in dealing with these problems of addiction has led to high recidivism rates among offenders. Furthermore, prosecuting and incarcerating these offenders has become very costly and time-consuming. It's draining the resources of the criminal justice system. Now, what are drug courts? Drug courts are judicially supervised programs that place drug-abusing offenders in intensive community-based treatment programs. These programs not only provide treatment, but also rehab services such as job training, parenting classes, anger management, GED assistance. Upon program completion, the court may dismiss the original sentence, reduce the sentence, set aside the original sentence, or offer a combination of any of these remedies. The drug court concept is not new. Initially in the 1950s, there were special drug case courtrooms established in New York City and Chicago. In the 70s, in order to deal with the heroin epidemic, there were narcotic courts established in New York City. However, none of these courts dealt with the problem of treatment. None of them provided treatment for offenders. The current drug court model began in 1989 in Dade County, Florida. As of June 2001, there are approximately 700 drug courts. Now, drug courts is a broad term to describe adult drug courts, juvenile drug courts, family drug courts, or a combination of all the above. There's also tribal courts that have been established. And there's currently 427 courts being planned. The goals of these courts are to provide the nonviolent substance abuser with treatment instead of punishment, to lower prison and jail populations, and to reduce crime and decrease court costs. Drug courts combine therapeutic treatment with the judicial process. Specifically, the courts are diversion to treatment programs that are supervised through regular quasi-judicial status hearings, in which the judge personally interacts with the defendant. It removes the adversarial nature of the whole court process. Basically, the judge becomes a paternalistic individual who follows the treatment of the client throughout the system. Even though drug courts differ based on jurisdiction, structure, client pool, there are 10 key characteristics. and I'll just run through them very quickly. One is the integration of drug treatment with case processing. Second, the use of non-adversarial approach. Early identification of clients, access to treatment, frequent drug testing to monitor performance, coordination between the court system and treatment providers, the judicial interaction between the judge, prosecutor, defense attorney, and client, monitoring and evaluation of programs, court personnel training, and development of networks, not only within the court system, but with community organizations and treatment providers. As of June 2001, there have been approximately 220,000 people who have been in drug courts, with 74,000 graduates and 77,000 people who are still in treatment. The total number of minor children of drug court participants is 75,000. So I think the implications are very clear. 56% of enrollees were previously incarcerated, as well as 65% of graduates. Furthermore, defendants who go through drug courts are most likely to stay in treatment. The retention rates for offenders involved in the drug court system are approximately 60%, compared to clients in other forms of treatment, which is 30%. Finally, drug courts are a cost-saving measure. The National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse estimates that for each offender who receives $6,500 per year in treatment, is calculated economic benefit of almost $69,000 in reduced crime, arrest, prosecution, and incarceration costs. It is projected that the average treatment component of a drug court program ranges between $900 to $2,000 per participant. Savings in jail bed days alone have estimated to be at least $5,000 per defendant. If this person was incarcerated, it would be $20,000 per year per inmate. In the short run, drug courts reduce costs to the system and provide treatment for substance abuse. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know I learned a lot. I was taking notes, because in case you guys didn't know, there's going to be a test on this on Monday, same time. So take, well, whatever. All right, I'm passing. That's all I'm saying. You know.
Me?
Our next guest, Vincent Irade, is the founder and executive director of the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice and its policy arm, the Justice Policy Institute. He has a 20-year history of research, public education, and direct services in the criminal justice field, and is focused specifically on the trade-off between higher education and prison funding. His research findings and commentary have been covered in print and electronic media all over the country. He served on the California Blue Ribbon Commission, on inmate population management, the National Criminal Justice Commission, and has chaired the San Francisco Juvenile Probation Commission. He has a master's in social work from NYU. Vincent, how you doing?
Good. How you
Okay, good.
You went with Vincent instead of Vinny, I could see.
Right. They told me that Vinny might not be
Man,
acceptable.
that worked. Okay.
Vincent, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about...
Because only my mother calls me Vincent. I just went.
Really? Well,
That's pretty much it. So.
guys, I'm just going to have to call him Vinny, if that's cool. Vinny, I was wondering, you know, one of your main areas of expertise is the trade-off between funding for higher education and prisons. But I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that, and also something that I'm really interested in. I was wondering if you could talk to us about privatization, the movement towards privatization in the prison industry, and what that means, you know, economically for states, and what are some of the, you know, pros and cons of privatization. Like, tell us what we should be concerned about.
Okay. When I was in college, I was a sophomore in college. I became the social chairman of my dorm complex, right, of the residential college. And in a neighboring residential college was another guy named Tom Eddy. He was a social chairman. I'll tell you a little about him, story to get us into the prison system. And we had a kind of hi, how you doing relationship. Wasn't a good friend, but it was sort of an acquaintance. And unbeknownst to me, Tom was dealing $10, grams of cocaine to other students in a dorm. And he came to the attention of the authorities, and they started making undercover buys for grams at a time. And then one day, the officer said he needed an ounce. You know, he was having a big party, and he needed to buy an ounce from Tom. And Tom said, "I can't get an ounce. I never had an ounce before." So the officer insisted it had to be an ounce. He got as many dimes as he could get together, you know, many grams as he could. Didn't have enough, so he cut it with some over-the-counter drugs, got it to be an ounce, and was arrested under New York's Rockefeller drug laws. I was in SUNY Binghamton at the time, which mandate a 15 to life sentence for sale of 1 ounce of cocaine, even if it has other substances in it. Tom was offered the opportunity to snitch on his supplier, but his arrest got fairly substantial notoriety in the university, and so he was unable to make any undercover buy. So he did get 15 to life for that. It's his first sale, and in New York, 15 meant 15. He couldn't get paroled earlier than that. And Tom's life, as my life sort of tracked, as I was going through the milestones of what people want to go through. You graduate from college, you get start your family and all that stuff. Every once in a while, Tom's life would sort of come back out at me. I graduated in 1981. We had about 500,000 people locked up then. We got about 2 million people locked up now. Parenthetically, it's about 5 times as many people as are locked up in all of the European Union. They got 100 million more people than we got. Then 1983, I got my degree from NYU. Tom was in his 4th year at that point. And I read an article about him on mandatory sentencing. They profiled Tom. When my first kid was born, Tom was in the middle of his sentence, 7.5 years. He was up for clemency, but Governor Cuomo, who was under a lot of pressure at the time because he vetoed a death penalty bill, denied Tom's clemency. Tom, at that point, he was like a cause celeb. He was on 60 Minutes. He had gotten his master's degree. He was a model inmate. He got parenthetically under the Pell Grant program, which subsequently was cut so that inmates couldn't get degrees anymore in the Pell Grant. Finally, when Cuomo was a lame duck after he lost to Pataki, he gave clemency to Tom in the waning months of his time. Tom had done 13.5 years at the time. At that time, I was teaching an adjunct at San Francisco State University, where the average time to get what was euphemistically called a 4-year degree took about 5.5 years, because there had been so many cuts to the state university system and the UC system that there weren't enough professors to teach enough courses for students to be able to pass through. So we started doing a bunch of studies on a trade-off between higher ed and corrections. And California had just built 21 new state prisons and 1 state university. In 1980, California was spending 3 times as much on higher ed as on prisons. By 1996, prisons had passed higher ed as a percent of the state budget. We're always passing laws, like the judge said, on these sort of hyper-violent criminals like Charlie Manson, but the proportion of California's prison population that was violent actually went down during the 1990s when they were building all those prisons. Meanwhile, the number of drug offenders in California prisons increased 25-fold. Since 1980, and California had more of its citizens locked up for drugs than any other state in the country, perhaps any other country in the world. Now, California's budget's capped by Prop 13, and so with these massive increases in prison costs, one of the ways they balanced that budget was on the backs of students and professors. Tenured track positions virtually vanished in California, and our political leaders openly lamented the brain drain as the state's best and brightest headed east, right? Meanwhile, Cal State tuition increased 8-fold during the 1990s. Now, the impacts of these were not felt equally amongst all racial ethnic groups, right? The number of black men attending UC actually dropped by 2% during the early 90s, while the number of black men going to prison increased 40%. By 98, there were 5 times as many black men locked up in California as enrolled in its universities. 3 times as many Latinos were added to prisons during the 90s as were added to universities. By 97, white families were spending 36% of their income to send 1 student to UC, which is considerable. For black families, it's 58%. I don't know how many of you started raising a family yet, but if you're a family and something really desirable, like a great education for your kid comes along that costs $6 out of every $10 you make, it doesn't happen. We looked at New York, which was pretty similar during the 1990s. They had more than a dollar for dollar shift from higher ed to corrections. There was a $761 million increase in prisons and a $615 million decrease in universities. By themselves, the Rockefeller drug laws were costing New York $680 million a year. So the whole decrease in the university system could be attributed to the Rockefeller drug laws. Majority of that prison growth came with drug offenders. 47% of the intake to New York prisons are drug offenders. That's the highest percentage in the country. Only 27% are violent offenders. New York's got the 4th highest per capita income in the country. They're 45th in spending on higher ed. And again, it's not falling equally on blacks and whites. 25% of the median income for white families is spent to send a kid to SUNY. It's 42% for black and Latino families. This is true nationally. Overall, nationally, between 87 and 95, there was a 30% increase in prison spending and 18% decrease in higher ed spending between 1987 and 1995. Just in 1995, prison construction funds increased by $1 billion statewide, nationally, and university construction expenditures decreased by $1 billion, same exact amount. So I want to offer 2 rays of hope in this somewhat gloomy conversation before I conclude. Last November, Californians passed a landmarked initiative to divert 35,000 people from state prison into treatment. That measure is going to save $150 million a year and funnel $120 million of it into a drug treatment superfund. It was backed by a group of wealthy philanthropists who have serious questions about the drug war. But on the other end of the social spectrum, young people, students, are getting increasingly involved in this debate. In May, for example, student organizers from the Prison Moratorium Project pressured Sodexo Alliance, which is the largest shareholder of, was the largest shareholder of the private prison company, Corrections Corporation of America. But also Sodexo is a provider of food service on many universities, to sell their private prison stocks. The students had convinced 6 universities, including American and Oberlin, to cease using Sodexo's food services on campus because of their CCA investments, which prompted the sellout. Ali Fleischer, the U.S. Student Association president, stated about this divestment, quote, "We've seen higher education budgets slashed to build unnecessary prisons. We don't want more of our dining dollars to feed this corrupt industry." The ascendance of prisons over universities, I think, is a very sad legacy. Driven by the imprisonment of nonviolent drug offenders, I think it's increasingly indefensible. At the vanguard of the debate are young people like yourselves, skeptical about the benefits of increasing prisons and acutely aware of the costs. So my closing thought is, if you found some of these statistics disturbing, I think that's good. Now, if you don't like the news, you should go out and make some of your own.
Challenge, right. I think that we'll find, hopefully, in the coming months that a lot of us are going to be dealing with some of these issues. A lot of us already have, and hopefully we'll take some of these challenges to heart, because it's important that we do. If we're really concerned, if we really came here to be leaders, if we came here to be leaders and change the world, then we should go change the world. But we're not done yet. Dr. Nogueira, Professor of Schools and Communities at the Ed School, the Graduate School of Education. He was previously a professor in social and cultural studies at the Graduate School of Education and the director of the Institute for the Study of Social Change at UC Berkeley. His research focuses on the ways in which schools respond to social and economic forces within the urban environment. He has engaged in collaborative research with several large urban school districts, and he has published and lectured on topics such as youth violence, race relations within schools, the potential impact of school choice and vouchers on urban public schools, and secondary issues resulting from desegregation in public schools. Dr. Nogueira, wow. Well, we want you to share with us, as you study social and economic forces that impact schools, school districts, administration, and that impact youth and communities. I wanted to know if you can share with us some of your thoughts on the links between education and incarceration, and what's going on in our school systems as far as preventative measures, regarding drugs or, crime in general among youth, and maybe where we can do better. You know, maybe are we going wrong in any way, and what can we do?
Okay, I'm going to start by giving a little background on my own experience in the drug war. From 1986 to 1988, I worked as assistant to the mayor of Berkeley, and that was during the period when crack trafficking hit hard in the community, just took off. Spent a lot of time during that period working with the police, trying to figure out how to respond. And the interesting thing was, probably the most cynical people I met about the whole drug war were the police. And that was because the police knew very well that there was nothing they could do to stop the problem. They also knew very well that the so-called drug houses where the drugs were being dealt changed. If that is, if you arrested people, they opened up within hours at another location. So what they did was more or less containment, right? Containing the drug trafficking to certain communities, because if you tried to sell drugs at least openly in other parts of the city, then they responded differently. They knew that drugs were being produced and sold throughout the city and consumed, but the war was fought in the black community. I say that because this war is being fought in black communities throughout the country. That is, we target the lowest level dealers, who are typically teenagers, because they're the foot soldiers in the drug. But we know full well that most of the money that's being made doesn't stay in the black community, that there are lots of legitimate businesses, including banks and others, who also are involved in laundering and in the profiteering that goes on in this drug trade. But we pretend to fight drugs by going after those who are most vulnerable in the name of supposedly making our society safer. Schools play an interesting role in all this because, as is true for many social problems, we look to schools to educate kids about the evils of drugs. And for the most part, that's taken the form of the Just Say No campaign, which by now is a pretty laughable effort because it hasn't stopped many people from trying drugs. We also use the scare tactics, right? These are your brains on drugs, this kind of an image. And then we use programs like Project Dare, where we get police officers to come in and tell kids about how dangerous drugs are. What we never do with kids, and we don't do this either with sex education, is address desire. That is, we never talk, why do people want to use drugs? Right? If you think about it, most people, whether it's the drug is cigarette or alcohol or any of the other illicit drugs, the first time they try it is not a pleasant experience for most people. That is, your first sip of whiskey is usually not a good experience. But people learn to overcome vomiting and coughing from cigarettes and to cultivate a taste for it, okay, and actually end up enjoying it, so much so that probably when this event is over, many of you will be sipping on some wine or beer this evening, if not other substances. Because many people enjoy the altered state, right, that they get from intoxication. We don't address that issue at all. That is, what is there, why this attraction to drugs? Why do we consume so much drugs? That part of it is never talked about, and therefore much of what we do in the name of prevention doesn't address what's really going on for kids. That is, why kids, even though they know it's dangerous, still use. We know that white affluent kids use more drugs. All the data, self-reporting data shows this. It's partially because they have more money. But again, we target, if you look at who gets arrested, who gets pushed out of school, we target primarily low-income kids of color. With the advent of zero-tolerance policies across the country that have been adopted to make schools safer, what we are seeing now is a steady stream of kids being pushed out of school and into the criminal justice system. And this happens both because kids who are pushed out of school because they've been expelled or on the streets, often with no place to go. But it also happens because there's now a tendency in many schools to criminalize young people for offenses that were once treated as school disciplinary issues. Whether that be a fight or possession of a drug or use of a drug, today, those kids who are caught with those kinds of offenses are more likely to have charges filed against them and the process started of developing a record and some interface with the criminal justice system. That's a new development. And again, that leads to this steady stream, particularly for poor kids of color, into prisons. So I would argue that rather than schools being an effective source of prevention, that in many ways our schools are complicit in channeling certain kinds of kids into our prison system. I'll just briefly describe a program that I helped to set up in Berkeley and that expanded into Oakland, which was aimed at trying to come up with a more enlightened approach to prevention. We were grappling with how to deal with this drug trafficking that was proliferating in the city and losing. And finally, the city decided that we needed a more effective prevention program. So we decided to create a program that would target kids at a young age, between the ages of 12 and 14, who had a first offense, first interaction with the police department, usually because they were dealing out on the streets. And that first offense would put them in a program. And the program provided them with a case counselor, the program provided them with tutoring, the program provided them with recreational activities, counseling, a number of services which they would not have had otherwise. And those services follow those kids throughout the course of middle school and high school. Over 80% of the kids who were in that program not only graduated from high school, but also had no prior contact with the police department. The reason why is because if we don't address the fact that many kids, particularly in the inner city, have not much to say yes to, right? That is, don't have a clear sense of how to support themselves, don't have a clear sense of where their future is heading, then the idea that we could merely stop drug use and drug trafficking, and in my own experience, I found that far more kids were addicted to drug dealing than to drug using, right? That is, the lure of the money was so seductive that was much more a problem than the use itself, because many of the kids saw what was happening to the adults who were using. If we don't address the economic dimensions of this, then our ability as a society to curtail is going to be very limited. I would also say, though, if we don't start to ask more fundamental questions about why, as a society, we consume so much. We are the world's largest market for drugs. What does that say about our culture? What does that say about our needs as a people? Why is it that so many of us need to be high in order to function? If we don't ask those questions, then we, again, are pretending to fight a war when, in fact, we're scapegoating those who are most vulnerable in the society.
All right. Now we have 2 microphones. If anyone has questions, if anyone would like to engage in further discussion with a specific panelist, or if you have just a question that you would like to throw out to any of the panelists, or if you have a question for me, I don't know. Come to one of the mics. Please introduce yourself, name, year, concentration, zodiac sign. And please speak up. Please try to keep it brief. We want to respect each other's opinions and thoughts, and we want to have a stimulating, open discussion. I'm gonna start on this side, and then I'm gonna alternate. So, first.
Okay. Hi, my name is Eddie. I'm a senior at the college, anthropology major. I had a question basically for the whole panel. I guess it's sort of a theme that I've been hearing in terms of the lack of opportunities for inmates in prison to receive, for example, drug treatment programs, or to receive. I'm an educator in prison, so like education, I've realized that it's a privilege to get education and to be able to get GED prep and things like that for when they get out of prison. And I'm wondering if that, what are steps that we can take, whether activists or policymakers or anything like that can take to get those opportunities available to prisoners or to inmates, so that when they leave prison, they'll have other choices to make and other opportunities. And also, the second part of the question is, does that have anything to do, like the lack of opportunities, with privatization at all?
Okay. Who feels ready to field this question?
Could I answer the question?
There you go.
Actually, I think I should give you the opportunity.
Thank you. My name's Jeanette Hanlon, and I run a faith-based criminal justice nonprofit called Partakers, Inc. Massachusetts, based on the Soros Foundation research, and Soros is one of the people who funded the proposition in California, which diverted a lot of drug offenders now into treatment rather than prison. Based on their research in 1998, we went from, in 1995, 350 college programs in prisons to 7 programs in 1998. One of those 7 programs is in Massachusetts. In order to get into the program, an inmate needs support from people like you all, and he also needs about $2,000 to get the initial credits through community college. After those initial credits, they then do on-site education for free through BU. I have a long pile of letters right now of inmates waiting to get into this program. If they succeed in getting a college degree, their chances of recidivism go from 66% nationally to below 10%, depending on the study. So this is a sales pitch, but I do it not for myself, but for all the inmates, most of whom are minorities, most of whom are men in Massachusetts prisons today waiting, and there will be information on this in the back. This is something that Harvard students for prison reform are involved in, and I myself am an urban fellow at the Divinity School. Thank you.
Thank you. Vinny, I saw your head nodding.
Yeah, well, a couple comments I would make. One is that the studies on recidivism aren't great because you can't randomly assign, you know, but the studies that exist right now are showing an inverse relationship right around what you said, somewhere between 60% for inmates that don't have degrees, down to 10-15% for inmates with bachelor's degrees.
And you said something about a grant program that was later cut, that you were talking about time.
Right, there was
that he was getting his master's degree. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I wasn't clear on.
Yeah, I mean, and really a lot of this is wrapped around the really mean-spirited approach to imprisonment that supersedes even justice and reasonable punishment. The Pell Grant program was eliminated in, I think it was 97, 95, for inmates for people who were trying to get their college degrees while they were in prison. It still exists for people outside of prison. But in California, for example, they refused to allow their inmates to access Pell Grants a year prior to its elimination, which meant they went so far as to say, we're not going to let our inmates get this federal money, which is being used to pay California professors to teach them. We're so damn mad at them. You know, we were so angry about crime that we're going to cut off our noses to spite our faces. And so, you know, that kind of approach, you know, of trying to reach out to people to help in prison, I think it's really a tangible thing that people could do. And then the other question, you know, connected to that was private prison stuff. You know, private prison providers they have to make money at the end of the day. And when a choice comes between paying guards decent salaries in private prisons, programming inmates in private prisons, and feeding the bottom line, they're going to feed the bottom line. So programming tends to be even less available in private prisons than it is in public prisons. And conditions are being shown in lawsuit after lawsuit and state after state to be worse, because you're not going to work in a prison for $20,000 if you can make $40,000. So the guys left to work in a $20,000 a year job in the private prisons are the guys who couldn't cut it in the public prisons. And so there have been a lot of incidents, a lot of lawsuits, and I think rightly so, private prisons are diminishing on state by state. There's many fewer of them in the last several years. The only place where there's more of them is in the federal system. They're actually sort of bailing out the private prison industry. But I think that's more philosophical than it is practical.
Okay, well, let's take another question.
I'm Marvin Abrams, a former visiting scholar at the Harvard Divinity School, and I'd like to hear some comments on legalizing the use of drugs, both from standpoint of selling and consuming. It's controversial. It's probably outside of the realm of political possibility. It's just the way it is. But I'm wondering what people think about that, so outside of politics, in terms of the impact, the desirability of a policy policy like that, because the current policy seems to hasn't done much of anything except create more problems and criminalize people and expand prison systems and so on and so on. It just doesn't seem to work. I'm just wondering about legalization.
Do you want to tackle this issue?
Yeah. Why do you say that you want to know outside of, I believe, politics, what is there that we can do when the issue is politics? I mean, it's just, I endorse everything I've heard from my fellow panelists here. Drug courts, great. The difference between spending money in prison in order to get them prepared out of prison, great. Mr. Nogueira tells me that there's no emphasis, not as much emphasis on supply. There's too much emphasis on supply when the emphasis ought to be on demand, reducing demand. All of that is political. All of that is political. Everything I should say or could say, and if you ask me, I will say, I'll just chicken out. It's politics. You want to change? Go to Congress. Get someone to sponsor a bill in Congress that legalizes, let's say, marijuana. Doesn't do much harm. Get me a sponsor to do that in Congress or the State House. I mean, this is a governor in there was a governor in the state who said, let me tell you what we should be doing. We should be reintroducing these people to the pleasure of breaking rocks. I'm not sure if you're old enough to remember that statement, but that's the governor of Massachusetts who said that at one time in order to reform the system. So why do you say out of politics? How do we do that?
Well, assuming you could do it within politics, as you say, would it be a good idea to do it?
Would it be a good idea to?
Is
Can you
it
clarify the question?
Medically, they do it.
Clarify.
Some places they do it. They've done it in Britain with, we do it even with heroin, or we used to do it with heroin, and in Britain they do it in some
Right.
places. Marijuana as a pain reliever is prescribed, can be prescribed, maybe even here. I'm no expert, and I don't know. I read what you read about that and the efficacy of it. I don't know, but I'm just intrigued by the notion that you think something in this area, this panel, can venture something in this area, at least me, let me speak only for myself, can speak to that without engaging in politics.
Right. I just would add, I would agree with the judge that you could make rational arguments in favor of legalization or
Right.
decriminalization. We already did it with alcohol, right, several years ago. So, I mean, that would make a lot of sense, and there are a lot of people, including the former Secretary of State, George Shultz, a number of people who have said this, people with credibility in some respects. But the politics of it are that no one running for office or currently serving would campaign on this platform. So, given that our policy is driven by politics, it's impossible to even get these more reasonable positions heard, unless, I would argue, it comes from, I would argue the politicians largely follow where they think public sentiment lies. And so unless there's a campaign afoot to educate the public on why marijuana or other forms of drugs should be legalized, very unlikely that it'll ever come from politicians.
I think that there's a middle point that is being tried now by the Soros people and others. It's called harm reduction, and it's not straight up legalization. And I think they've been clever about their approach. What the initiative that passed in California, makes it so that you can't get time for your first 2 drug possession arrests or convictions, and that's a sea change for California. Every politician opposed it for exactly the reason, except for Tom Campbell, who was running for senator against Dianne Feinstein on a Republican ticket. But now now that that's passed, they're going on to Florida and Ohio. And the polling in Ohio shows almost an 80% approval rating for this same initiative, actually a little broader. And what's interesting is the Buckeye poll, which is an Ohio poll, did a separate poll that was publicized in many of the papers showing 74% approval. As a result, since this poll's come out so much earlier than a November election, many of the politicians are not opposed to this legislation, and they haven't come out in support of it yet. But in California, they were, tooth and nail opposed to it. And I think that speaks exactly to what you're saying, sort of as the public leads, the elected officials are following, not the other way around on this. That harm reduction is not legalization, but when you chip away at things like that with the medical marijuana initiatives, you know, you pass the medical marijuana initiative, then what? You know, then where does a 70-year-old woman, cancer patient, score, right? Where's she gonna score? What's she gonna do? You know, how's she gonna get that marijuana? She's gotta go to street corners and buy it. So then people start to set up distribution. What happens then? The federal court has to make a decision as to whether they're going to intervene in San Francisco, for example, and bust them and shut them down against the state's wishes. So a whole bunch of interesting, complicated things have occurred because of a fairly innocuous medical marijuana initiative, and now they're occurring because of the Prop 36 type things that aren't straight legalization, but the harm reduction, and I think that holds some political promise.
Okay. I'm going to try to fit in as many of these questions as we can. I know that we're all brilliant and we're all prone to discussing, or we're prone to discourse. Yeah, one of my professors was talking about that word the other day. Anyway, you know, he was talking about postmodernism. I didn't know anything about it. Next question.
Hey, I'm not going to have a discussion with anybody. My name is Omar Abdul Malik. I'm a graduate student here at the Kennedy School. And I'm from Washington, D.C. I have some experience with drug rehab programs and also with the correction system there. And it seems like the three issues that continually come up when you're dealing with especially with the population, the vulnerable population that the brother was talking about, the teenage dealer or the teenage to early 20s dealer. And basically, the issue deals with long-range goals as opposed to short-range goals. You know, what am I going to do today to get something that I want tomorrow? Values change, both of the individual and the community that tolerates that. Because there are other communities in similar cities that will not allow people to stand on the corner and distribute drugs and market drugs. And then the other thing is, how do we go about attacking the importers at the source, you know, the people that actually bring the drugs in large quantities into the country, you know, prior to it being cut and distributed down to the low-level dealers where it's like 5% purity. So we can discuss that.
Okay, a multi-layered
That's
question.
healthy. Somebody.
I would like to address the last part of your question about supply versus demand. In 1992, RAND did a study looking at the effectiveness of drug treatment versus domestic law enforcement versus interdiction versus stopping drugs at its source. And RAND found that drug treatment was 7 times more effective than domestic drug law enforcement, 10 times more effective than interdiction, and 23 more times more effective than stopping the drugs at the source. I think the solution, one of the solutions, is that you have to decrease the demand for drugs. And one way is through treatment and through education.
A little story, just to respond to the first part. I was asked by a school to talk to some bad boys, kids who were given trouble at school. And it's a group of about maybe 13 kids that I sat down with, and all boys, all black. And we were talking about school, and it came out quickly that every one of them claimed that they were involved in selling drugs. And so we got into a debate about that, and I was losing. Nothing I said could convince them that what they were doing was wrong. And I kept trying different arguments, nothing. So finally, I asked one of them, I said, well, would you sell drugs to your sister if she wanted it? And he said, no. I said, why not? He said, because it's poison. And then I said, well, would you sell drugs to your friend's sister? So everybody said, yes. I said, why? He said, because it's a business. And at least I could get her good drugs. And I asked the other one, I said, well, how do you feel about the fact that he would sell drugs to your sister? He said, well, that's not right. He's supposed to be my friend. Suddenly, suddenly I found an opening, right, which had to do with the ethics of what they were doing. And the ethics of it is something that again, isn't discussed in school, right? There's so much that we don't discuss in school. I would say that if you're going to seriously engage kids about this, dealing with ethics is one part. The other part of it, though, is dealing with the economics of it, right? There is a myth that some kids can make so much money from drugs that they won't take a job at a fast food restaurant. Fact is that most of them aren't making a whole lot of money. That's right.
They're working hard.
That's right, and they're working long hours outside in the cold. And so the idea that that jobs wouldn't make a difference is really false for a lot of kids. But if we really want to create alternatives for kids, we do have to talk about jobs and educational opportunities if we want to see kids embrace alternatives.
Okay, we're going to take a question from that side.
Hi, my name is Alon Geva. I'm a freshman at the college. And Dr. Nogueira, you mentioned the issue of desire. How do you start dealing with desire among teenagers with the complexity of the issue? Kids do it for so many different reasons: boredom, rebellion, stress. Where do you start, and how do you deal with this issue of desire?
I think you start honestly and let them know that, because the kids are seeing it. They see their parents, and they see other adults doing it. And so they know that people do it because they like it, right? And so you deal with honestly talking about the fact, why do people do it? And then to talk about the consequences of it. It helps, for example, if you can bring in people who've been strung out and who've recovered to talk about what their lives were like as a result of addiction. The more realistic, the better chance we have of getting kids to make other choices. Because that's ultimately what we've got to do, is to help kids to make good choices themselves. But I think we've got to be honest, and the more honest, the better.
Okay. Question?
Hi, my name is Ethan Ye, and I'm a junior at Harvard College. I was particularly interested and also alarmed by the trade-off that you mentioned between education, higher education, and incarceration. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that specifically, like how direct the trade-off is, how causal it is, and if it is true, then whether institutes of higher education are actually involved in discussing or reforms to prison, and whether, if it's not direct, whether the other services or programs that are being cut as well, whether there's some way to build a coalition between them with institutes of higher education to try to do something about this.
Yeah. When you talk to budget analysts, they'll tell you about 75% of most state budgets year to year are population driven, or sort of automatic, right? K through 12 education, health and welfare, those are big chunks of things that pretty much pass every year with minor cuts here and there. There's about 25% of the budget left that everything else comes out of. Out of that 25%, higher ed, depending on the state, let's say California, out of that 25%, about 9% of it is prisons, and about 8% of it in California is higher ed, and then about 7% is everything else the state does. So to the degree that prisons went from 3% to 9%, they took a bite out of that 25%, part of which was higher ed. And they're not taking bucket loads of money from the universities and driving them over to the prisons, but roughly speaking, that's pretty much it. And they also, from a sort of more philosophical, social policy standpoint, they target the same audience, y'all, right? They target young people, mostly males in the prison system, more diverse group in the universities, but it's a young man's game in prison, and so the money comes out of the same chunk, and it does target the same audience. University professors, present company, here, are pathetic when it comes to fighting the hard-knuckle battles that it takes to get money out of the state budget systems, and prison guards are increasingly good at it and sophisticated. When Pete Wilson ran last time for governor of California, the prison guards gave $947,000, which I thought was a huge amount of money. When Gray Davis ran, they gave $2 million. There's a big building just a couple blocks away from the Capitol that the prison guards built and own for their lobby. When you call the University of California lobby, a woman in Riverside County's 12-year-old daughter answers the phone. She's the professor that. So now it's got to be university boosters that do it. The professors are not going to organize. They're cats. They don't organize on this stuff. Prison guards is a real sort of union, blue-collar thing.
I could just add, too, on the whole prison guard issue. The starting salary for a prison guard in California is about $47,000 a year. Starting salary for a teacher in California is about $32,000 a year. So, I mean, there are the connections between these two systems are pretty profound. And Vince is right that the prison, I mean, not only do you have to deal with the correctional officers as lobbyists, but communities as lobbyists for prisons. because increasingly prisons are seen as an economic development opportunity because of the jobs they generate. So there is a market out there for prisons, and if you build it, they need to fill it.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
I want to add something because I want to contribute something, and I feel that I'm a sentencing judge, you see, and this is not my milieu. This is where the game is being played. If you could do it, I don't know how you can get on the field of education, but to answer your question, I can only tell you from my experience. That when we prepare for a sentencing hearing, we receive from a probation office a very detailed page after page of details about the offenders, the convicted offender, the defendants, background, education, family, employment, vocational skills, maybe military service, and any other special characteristics. As I say, I've been a sentencing judge for a long time. It's never something I've ever enjoyed. No judge enjoys it. But I can tell you that the vast majority of kids or defendants that I have seen over the years lack one essential element that all of us in here have, and that is an education. I don't sentence anybody, well, really, stock traders or tax evaders, but I sentence rarely in the drug offenses anybody who has had a good education, good community support, good family support, family ties. So this is where it has to be done, right here. By the time it gets to me, there's very little I can do. I'd like to be paternalistic to some of the people I see as the drug court can. And we have district courts in here who have done something not exactly like that, like Judge Fitzgerald does in Chicago. But there's very little I can do here, except second, again, endorse what they say. And then somebody else over there said something about decriminalization. I was a little too quick with that and did not give enough thought to it, because I do know that the efforts, you're still here, yeah, the efforts being made to decriminalize. Years ago, I'm not sure how many, maybe 4, 5, 6 years ago, there was a mayor of Baltimore named Kurt Schmoke. He was an advocate of decriminalization. He said very simply, look, it's not working. The war, we're losing this war, and we have to do something else. And he ran for office several times after saying that, and he won. And he chose not to run. And that's the only reason he's not there now. So there is that. There are some courageous people out there who might take up that cause, but not enough. I'm sorry.
That's cool. I mean, we definitely want all your contributions if we can squeeze them in.
Hi, my name is Gerard McGeary. I'm a sophomore from the college, and I live in Connecticut. And one of the big events this summer happened on July 4th at a celebration in Hartford. And it was a regular family barbecue. And there was this 7-year-old girl named Takira Gaston who got shot by a drug dealer, and it was a turf battle. So the Hartford Current made a decision with the permission of the family to publish a picture of the girl when she was in the hospital after she had come out of surgery. It was a very horrible photo, and you really got to see the ugliness of what drugs do and what drug-related crime causes. So what happened was the Hartford Police Department, with the cooperation of the community, cracked down on sellers and buyers. And then they got a list of all the buyers. And what it was a bunch of kids from suburbia coming into Hartford to get their drugs. Not just, crack and cocaine, but most kids were coming in to get marijuana, and then going back to their, towns and using it with their friends. And so a group of community leaders organized people from Hartford, and they went to all the neighborhoods from people's names on a list and said, this is not only our fight, but everybody's fight. You've talked about education and about the need to reduce demand. And my question is that how much education is directed at the crime that users create by their demand? I don't think most people think when they smoke, some marijuana, that they're contributing to crime in the cities. the crime that they see, you know, on television, the jails filling up. I don't think they feel that they're contributing to that crime. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think, I mean, this goes back to the arguments for legalization again, because it's illegal, people who deal are often forced, and they can't get protection to deal. They use force to deal, right? And so drug trafficking breeds violence as a byproduct of the activity. And we all know that wherever it's being done. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, that although the drugs may be sold in the inner city, the consumers are not limited to the people who live there, right? I mean, all you have to do is go to Washington Heights, right there by the George Washington Bridge, and you will see lots of the same, I guess, from Southern Connecticut, on the way before they get to the bridge, stopping off to get whatever it is they're getting. So I think it's that the part of the problem, and I mean, I think Vince spoke to this already, is that there's this duplicity about who we target and how we go about targeting the drug war. And that's not an argument in favor of targeting everybody, right? Because I think that, in fact, what we need to do is to really advocate a much more of a public health approach to dealing with the problem than one that emphasizes law enforcement the way we do, as a way to reduce the violence associated with the drug trafficking.
You know, I started with Tom Eddy for a reason. You know, he's a white guy, he's National Merit Scholar, honor student, good school, social chairman, which, you know, wasn't nothing. It's the guy that ran the party, so it was a much sought after position. And you know, there's a white guy selling a bunch of other white guys in school, and his case is really unfair in some ways because, you know, cops aren't kicking down the doors at frat houses and making busts. They're sweeping kids off street corners in South Central LA and, you know, Anacostia and Harlem. I don't want to turn our criminal justice system into the criminal justice system that poor blacks get. I want to turn it into the criminal justice system that middle class and affluent whites get. I mean, I think we actually have a reasonably good justice system in America. It's the one that kicks into gear when a white kid gets arrested, right? When that happens, you treat the kid like it's an individual. I've seen it in court, you know, because we do direct services. You know, we're working with kids all the time. And, you know, that kid's going to come in, he's going to have a coach, both his parents are going to be there, his minister's going to be there, they're going to have a drug treatment program set up, they're going to have a special school set up, and that judge is going to have a lot more options looking at that kid, and they're going to say, all right, maybe I'll take a chance on this kid. You know, a black kid comes in, is poor, maybe he's a single mom, and she can't get the day off because she already took a couple days off for his hearing. Public defender's rifling through the papers trying to figure out what his name is, and you know, urging him to take a quick plea because he's only going to do a short bid on it. That kid's walking in whether they committed the same crime or not. And, you know, this is a system full of real people, you know, with real faces and real lives on both sides, victims and offenders. Many feel real pain, they really suffer, they have real hopes and real aspirations, just like everybody in this room does. And I think that it's a lot easier for people to wave a wand and see black faces like yours as all the same faces, you know, and to prescribe mandatory sentences and mass decision-making in ways that you don't when it's an individual white kid whose individualization is being forced upon the system. So I don't know if that quite answered your question, but that just struck me as you were talking.
I think Judge Mazzone wants to comment. Judge Mazzone, and then
Well,
Natasha, if you have.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
For a second. Just
Well,
go
the
ahead.
question has vast implications, you see, because first of all, I'm in the federal system, not the state system. But the idea that, what's his name, Vinny?
Vinny, yeah.
Yeah, Vinny. What Vinny said is that the kid comes in with his coach and his minister and is true. And in the federal system, it was true. And in the federal system, there was a time when I would look around and say, well, this kid's got a lot of support, this defendant, and I'm going to cut a break for this kid because I'm confident that this is going to work out. That discretion was taken away from us by the Sentencing Reform Act and the sentencing guidelines. The sentencing guidelines say specifically, you sentence within this range, and if you depart outside that range, either down or up, you give specific reasons, but these are some of the reasons that you cannot give. Education, community ties, family background, vocational skills. So we are instructed as sentencing judges today that it is inappropriate to consider education as a modifier, so to speak, in the federal system. It's one of the biggest problems with the federal system because it leads to high sentences. But at the same time, your question is, his response is, a person of color is going to get treated differently because it's likely he's not going to have the coach and the minister and in the federal system, the non-person of color is going to get treated exactly the same. Whether that's good or bad, again, I don't know. We don't have that latitude anymore. But when this act was passed, John Conyers, a congressman from Detroit, stood up and said, you know what's going to happen here? Black kids in my community are going to get targeted. This is aimed at black kids. When we did the crack cocaine study, all we were talking about is black kids using crack and white kids coming into the city to buy powder because they could afford it, but the black kid was taking a little knuckle of crack for $10, while the white kid could come in and buy several grams. So we tried. When I said it was a frustrating time for me, we tried, but didn't have too much luck because Congress knocked it down. Sorry.
That's all right. Natasha, you want to address this question? And then after that, there's a reception upstairs. Our panelists will be there. We can all have more discussions. There's a reception in the penthouse. And later, there's a masquerade ball in Adam's house at 10. So I hope you guys come, show up, you know, dress up, have a little mask. You know, maybe you can win the prize. I don't know. I think I'm ineligible, but that's okay, whatever. Natasha, you want to address that question?
Yes, just very briefly, I just wanted to address what you had said about viewing substance abuse as a public health problem. And some of the perceptions have been that illicit drug abuse has been seen as a law enforcement problem or even a moral problem, but not addressing the whole issue of it being a medical disease. Substance abuse is a relapsing disorder, and there are public health implications. In 1995, $110 billion of economic loss went towards illicit drug use, and this involved treatment, property loss, as well as the loss suffered by victims of crime. And so one of the solutions is and needs to be that we just need to look at the framework and change the framework and the dialogue of how we do look at substance abuse.
Dr. Counter, ladies and gentlemen, from the Harvard Foundation.
Well, no, I just wanted to thank all of the very fine students who made this evening possible. This has been a very impressive panel. We have been truly enlightened, and I really would like to thank the panelists on behalf of the Harvard Foundation, the Dean of the college. You've done a marvelous job, and we greatly appreciate your coming out tonight to join the students. Marcel Anderson, all of the students who made this possible. So thank you. You deserve a round of applause as well.
If you could give this to me, I'm going to remember that.
Can I just say one more thing before we close up? I spewed a lot of numbers out at you for any of them who care to look them up just in case there is a quiz on Monday. CJCJ.org. And for those of you who might want to get involved with that youth organizing effort, NoMorePrisons.org is the Prison Moratorium Project's website.
Could you, if you...
How about a very large donation of money?
If
very large.
you want to deal with the panelists?
Of course.
Reception, then we can do that, but we have to go now. We have to wrap this up.
Not even for $1 trillion donation, which I'm offering. That's easy. The largest lawsuit in the world was $246 billion dealing with the tobacco industry. Am I correct? Am I correct? Panelists? Yes?
I don't deal in those numbers.
Well, I only...
those numbers stagger me.
Well, they do deal with the constitutional violation of gender, Article 1, Section 8, don't they?